Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Today we're going to talk about data curation in general, and we've got a real panel set up here. So the folks that are on the panel are going to come up and not be allowed any slides, with one small exception, and they're going to actually talk about data curation and how they perceive it from their different fields, because they're all kind of from different stakeholder communities for data curation. But before that, and while hopefully lots of people filter in, I'll go over a quick overview of the current landscape of data curation as it stands right now. First, I'm Carly Strasser. I'm from the California Digital Library. If you were here yesterday, I did a demo of the Data Up tool, and my Twitter handle is down there in the corner. But today, I'm kind of wearing my overall data curation hat as opposed to my Data Up hat in particular. So as we're all aware, and even more aware now that we've been at this conference for the last day and a half, there's a lot of digital data out there. It's being generated in large quantities. Researchers and scientists are more and more bringing electronics out into the field to collect their data. They're getting sensor information, satellite information. They're using very complex programs to collect these data. And then all of this is fed into a large variety of programs. And all the different types of programs that researchers can use generate different types of files, different kinds of organization of the information. And working with all of that basically guarantees that you have a really complex workflow system. And if you combine the digital data and the complex workflows and all the different ways that you can arrange those data, you end up with kind of a train wreck in terms of what these researchers' data sets look like and how they're organizing their data on a day-to-day basis. So if we think about data and metadata in terms of how researchers think about it, they think of it as fodder for writing a paper. So they write this paper, they publish it in a journal. The journal then becomes either a hard copy or an electronic copy in the library. But the underlying data and the metadata, they tend to go into filing cabinets or maybe computer files, and then all too often those end up becoming obsolete. Either the hardware or the software becomes obsolete, or the actual information gets damaged or thrown out. And so this is not an ideal situation, and figuring out a way to kind of curate these data and these metadata and make sure that they're preserved for the long term is what this data curation thing is all about. So what we want, instead of that bottom scenario, is to have the data going into some sort of a electronic repository in digital format, and then be publicly available, probably via the web, and available for anybody who wants to use the data without any sort of restrictions on that. And of course, all of this starts with really good data management. So data management is the foundation for the idea that you need to share your data. So if you don't manage your data well, it's going to be very difficult to push it out to the community and allow others to use your data. And then of course, data reuse is even more difficult because you have to have a very solid understanding of the data set that you're working with. And for you to have that solid understanding, then the person has to have really done a good job of documenting the data for you. So unfortunately, there's an ugly truth here, which is many or most researchers are not taught data management. They're not efficiently managing or organizing their data. They don't share their data publicly. They don't store it in any kind of an archive. They aren't actually always convinced that they should share their data, and they don't know about a lot of the tools that are available to help them with this process. So why do we have all of these problems? What's the issue here with good data curation for scientific research data? There's some hurdles, and the biggest one, the one that most researchers will point to immediately, is cost. And that cost is in terms of personnel and time, and it's in terms of the hardware and the software that you need, in terms of the long-term archiving costs for storing data. And all of these things contribute to the fact that they're not going to be able to do justice to their data. There's also a lot of confusion about standards. There's lots of different standards out there: metadata standards, file format standards, other documentation standards, and they're confused and they don't know who to turn to, and often they don't even realize that there might be help out there for them. There's also this problem of disparate data sets, so trying to merge different data sets, even if they've been collecting information on the same system, can often end up, it can be very challenging to merge those because They were collected in different ways, maybe organized in different ways, stored in different ways, and that makes it incredibly challenging also to build the infrastructure to ingest these data and archive them for the long term. There is a lack of training, even though there has been discussions today about educating scientists and librarians in these various data stewardship roles. There's still very minimal amounts of that going on in the graduate studies for sciences. They're really not learning this yet. There's also a big problem with a fear of lost rights or benefits. So researchers get really nervous about sharing their data. This varies a lot depending on the field, but often if you ask a researcher how they feel about sharing data, they're way less likely to be willing to do that early in their career because they're worried about tenure and promotion. Older scientists maybe not so much worried about that, but again, it varies a lot depending on the field you're looking at. And in general, there's no incentives, at least from the perspective of the scientist. So it takes a lot of time and energy to do this work and to properly document your data and archive it. And they're not really getting rewarded for that in any of their day-to-day activities. So how do we get to this, this ideal of archiving all of the data that are supporting publications, and even the ones that maybe aren't supporting publications, getting those archived into some sort of a repository? Maybe the first question to ask is who cares? Who cares about whether or not these data actually end up being archived? So certainly the funders care. The funders are investing the money in this and they want to make sure that they're getting the most out of their investment. There's also colleagues that care, so people that you're working with as a researcher that may benefit from using your data or from collaborating with you. Your institution is going to care because your institution, just like the funder, has been contributing to that data set, contributing to the performance that you've pulled off because you collected those data. So making sure that other people can find that data and use it is going to go a long way for promoting them. And then future scientists. So others that are going to want to use that data set that you've collected and actually do something really interesting with it that you haven't even considered yet sometime in the future. So there's this great phrase, data as first-class products of research, which when I did a little Googling, it's hard to figure out who said it first, but you came up as somebody who said it at some point back in 2010 or so. So interestingly, 2008, excuse me. So it's a really great concept of just thinking about the fact that as a researcher, we're really, I'm a researcher by training, and as researchers, we're really focused on the publication. We're really focused on the H factor and the impact factors and being able to show a nice long laundry list of proposals to the tenure committee. And we need to elevate data to the same level of importance as publications have. So we're going to put our little data guy in first class and hopefully kind of start thinking of it in terms of being just as important and in some cases maybe more important than that giant list of publications that you're generating. So how do we go about that? So requiring data management is a great first step, and people are starting to require data management. So journal publishers are one example of this. The Joint Data Archiving Policy or agreement is something that's come out of the Dryad repository, and this is a list of the, this is an old list, an unupdated list of the different journals that have an agreement with the Dryad repository, so that if you put your paper in one of these journals, you have to put your data that's associated with that paper in Dryad. So it's really great to kind of push this to the forefront. If you want to publish in the American Naturalist, you have to start thinking about archiving your data. There's also the ESA policy for data registry and making sure that you put your data somewhere if you're publishing in any of the Ecological Society of America journals. The American Naturalist has some great supporting data and material words that they have on their website if you're going to contribute data or a manuscript. And even the larger journals like Nature are now starting to have words like required to make materials data and associated protocols available to readers. So depending on how strong you think that wording is, I don't think it's strong enough, but we're moving in that direction at least. We're at least starting the conversation as people are publishing. They're going to start having to think about data archiving. So the funders are also putting out some data management requirements, and just recently the National Science Foundation has changed some of their wording for the biographical sketches so that now in those biographical sketches, before you were supposed to list publications, and now you can actually list products. So that can include, but not limited to, publications, data sets, software, patents, and copyrights. So again, just kind of refocusing our energy on the fact that it's not always all about the publications. The data might actually be important too. There's also a move towards publishing data. So data publication and data journals have become a little bit more popular in the last few years. So there's Ecological Archives from the Ecological Society of America, which accepts data papers. So these are basically papers with a cover sheet on them that are, have the abstract and the information, but they're intended to be kind of standalone digital objects, separate from the paper or the traditional publication. There have also been some great papers that have come out just kind of looking at the idea of this data paper as a mechanism to incentivize data publishing. So this is for the biodiversity science community. And then the GBIF, Global Biodiversity Information Facility, also kind of thinking about, they had a great little article about this first database-derived data paper published in a journal. So again, just kind of slowly but surely pushing in the direction of recognizing data as being very important. Also, data citation has become important in recent days, and if you're not familiar with that, a data citation basically looks just like a paper citation. This is an example for a data set that's in the Dryad Digital Repository. It's got that DOI. It's really easy to reference if you use it in a publication, and that makes it much easier for people to get credit for those data sets that they're generating. So this is a little graphic from the Dataverse network, which is basically to say, if you have your publication and you have your data, then the data citation is really what's linking those two pieces together, and it makes it much easier for you to get credit. And if you need to know more, there's a great organization called DataCite. So datacite.org is an international organization that's working on promoting data citation and making that easier for researchers. And the Easy ID system is a partner with DataCite. That's at the CDL where I work at California Digital Library. And they actually help generate DOIs and other types of identifiers for things like data sets or other digital objects. And we also need to think about creating incentives to make it easier for people to think of data as a first-class object. And so how do we incentivize? We start talking to the tenure and promotion committees and boards and the higher-ups in the institutions that we're at, and really start to bring about this conversation that data should be recognized in this process. And so, of course, you also have this carrot and stick thing. So depending on what you want to think of as the word incentivize, funders requiring this type of data management planning and archiving is going to go a long way towards pushing it to the forefront of the minds of the researchers. And then finally, providing infrastructure and tools. So the first infrastructure piece I want to mention is Data One, and that's because two of our panelists are associated with Data One. And if you heard Bill Michener talk earlier, then you already know this, but this is a little different. So Data One is an NSF-funded DataNet project from the Office of Cyber Infrastructure, and the URL is right there. And what Data One is best shown with this great little graphic that I didn't do. If you think of these three little silos as data repositories for earth, environmental, and ecological data, then as a researcher, here in the corner, and you're looking for a particular set of data about something you're interested in, you have to query each one of those data repositories individually, wait for that information to come back to you. She turned into a little sad face there because the data she got back wasn't what she wanted, and it was a lot of effort to go to each of those repositories to look for the data. They all had different systems set up that made it more challenging. So what Data One does is it has these three repositories kind of talking to one another, and then she can query Data One, and Data One asks the general pile of repositories that are part of Data One, and then she gets the answer that is for all of those repositories that are within the Data One infrastructure. And the nice thing about Data One is that they have something called the Investigator Toolkit. So they're thinking about the actual cyber infrastructure to link together all these repositories, but they're also thinking about figuring out ways to intercept researchers where they already work in terms of archiving and managing their data. So they have all kinds of tools in the Investigator Toolkit that hit on these various programs that are already being used by researchers. And so figuring out ways to really integrate the fact that they're generating data and they're eventually going to want to archive that data and integrating right into that workflow to make it really easy. So this is the life cycle that Bill showed earlier for the data. This is just the data life cycle, and so all these different tools that they've generated can kind of be used at different parts of that data life cycle, including data up, which is up here, which is the tool that I demoed yesterday during the Demo Fest. So if you didn't get to stop by, just very briefly, the data up tool is a project that we worked on with Microsoft Research and the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. And the idea was to facilitate data archiving, sharing, and publishing. And the way that we went about that is to focus on helping researchers with their data management and organization. And then in turn, this is going to facilitate data reuse and reproducibility. So Data Up is an open source tool. It's focused on earth, environmental, and ecological researchers, but it's going to be useful for pretty much anybody that uses an Excel spreadsheet. And it comes in both an add-in and a web application. So the add-in is for Microsoft Excel Windows. The web application is for any operating system. And the basic features are that it does a best practices check, it generates metadata, it generates a citation, and it helps you post data to a repository. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because I'm just going to assume that you all stopped by and saw the demo. But the important thing to note is that it does deposit into a repository, which right now is the OneShare repository. And this is partnered up with Data One and the UC3 Merit repository. So this is the University of California Curation Center, which is the group that I work with at CDL. We partnered with Data One. OneShare is kind of a special repository in the Data One infrastructure that allows anybody to deposit data. All they need is an email address, and they can put the data in OneShare. So what this basically does is add another little repository in the corner there specifically for the data up data. If you want to know more, there's a URL for it. And in the future, what we're really hoping is that we're going to build a community around the data up tool, and people are going to be able to take it and really apply it to their particular system, whether it be a new repository or a new metadata standard. We want to add more repositories, and then we want to add more metadata schema. The second tool I want to mention is the data management plan tool. So this is DMP tool. You can get to it with that URL up there. And the idea behind the DMP tool is basically to help researchers generate a data management plan that is now being required by a lot of these funding agencies. So they support a long list of funding agencies, including all the NSF directorates and divisions. You can go in and for free, you can build that data management plan out using kind of a wizard template that they create for you. So with that 18-minute quick introduction, so this is my information, but more interestingly is the panel who can now come up. This is the list of the folks that are going to be on the panel up here. So we're going to discuss a little bit of data curation now. Our panelists come from lots of different groups, and I actually just kind of gave them some sort of a phrase so that you could keep them all straight here. Jeff is hiding, but yes, there's Jeff. Jeff is a researcher at UC Santa Barbara, and he just did some great sessions next door about publishing the new forms of publication and e-publication. Let's see, Bill, so he's kind of our scientist. He's wearing his scientist hat. Bill Michener is, raise your hand, Bill. There's Bill Michener. So if you missed him, he's the head of the Data One organization. He's based out of University of New Mexico, and he's kind of the brains behind that whole project. Chris Menzel is there. He's from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. He's the guy that we spoke to who helped us get money to create Data Up. So he's kind of representing the funders. Dave Vieglis is right there. He's the cyber infrastructure dude because I don't really know what else, like the tech guy, I don't know. So he is in charge of all of the cyber infrastructure for the Data One organization. So he's definitely kind of keeping in mind the fact that there's a lot of moving parts beneath all of this stuff that we're talking about. And Stephanie Wright on the end there, she's the librarian hat. So she's from University of Washington, and she is a data services coordinator. That's her role there. So she's thinking about how to integrate data services with what the scientists really need kind of on the ground. So I told them that they all have about 5 minutes to kind of give a little spiel. I should get this microphone. And then we'd have some question and answer, and if you guys are all quiet, then I'll prompt them with questions. But let's see. Would you like to go first? Would you like your slide up?
Yeah, okay. So we all obeyed Carly's instructions to not bring slides for this, but I just couldn't resist. But I just have one. So, so an issue that I worry about in terms of data. Hello?
There you go.
Okay. So the issue I worry about with data is data quality, and this not only applies to the to these modern methods of researchers putting data into archives, but it also applies to the data that are normally available. And I didn't realize this until I was kind of well into my career, partly because in graduate school and my initial research afterward, that work was entirely based on measurements that I made in the field. And I was pretty good at, keeping quality control, and the data there weren't that many of them. But when I started to use data that were collected by others, and particularly data that sit out in the environment and do things automatically, like precipitation gauges and snow pillows and things like that. So to illustrate this, the kind of thing, when I was visiting Microsoft in Seattle this summer, I went over to the University of Washington and gave a lecture. And I was showing, in my lecture, I showed some snow pillow data. And I particularly picked a pillow in the area where Jessica Lundquist works, because she was there with her students, and I knew their students, they'd be interested in the problem, but the fact that I was using data from an area where they had a lot of experience, would make the lecture more meaningful. And so afterward, I left, and the next day I got a really nice email from Jessica Lundquist and how much she and her students had enjoyed my talk. But she said, there's something you should know about the snow pillow, the Dana Meadows snow pillow, because she had noticed that it wasn't correlating very well with some of the measurements of the other snow pillows and the stream gauges around it. And if you note in this graph here, it's measuring 4 inches of snow water equivalent. And yet, if you look around it in the background, there doesn't appear to be much snow there. Well, there was a tree growing in the snow pillow. and so because of her concern, they said, well, let's go out and look at this place where these measurements are being taken. And indeed, there's a tree growing out of it. And when she removed it, the snow water equivalent dropped by 12 inches. It actually dropped to negative 8 inches. And so that pillow has to be recalibrated. But we know that data have errors in them. But in surveying, there's an interesting distinction that one makes between errors and blunders. And so one of the difficulties with stuff that is measured in the field, and probably in the laboratory, is there are blunders. And once these get put into databases, and once they sit there in the archive for a long time, they're still there. And the problem is that when you run models using data that have blunders, those things propagate through to the model results. And there's no way that you can assign an error distribution to them. So one of the things that I think is really important for not only for this sort of citizen science where researchers put data into the archives themselves, but there should also be a mechanism for people to be able to publish errors that exist in conventional data sources. Because otherwise, a lot of the work I do in in using data that are available, from the Weather Service and the California Snow Survey and the Department of Resources is I've done a lot of cleanup. And if I hadn't done that, the papers that I publish and the presentations I make would contain these sort of artifacts. And so one of the things that I think is really important in this whole effort is having tools that help us clean up data. For example, to see whether there's something that looks funny in a particular data set, and then to search for other instances of whatever it caused us concern. So a good example of where people have really done a lot of work cleaning up data to make them useful is that there are shipboard observations of weather and clouds and things like that that go back to the 1600s. And if you look at those original data, a lot of those observations are on land. Now, the ships were not on land, but the latitude and longitude that were written down when those measurements were made were not where the ship was. And the problem with that is that it's easy enough to throw out those shipboard's observations that are on land, but that also means that there are locational errors in the observations made on the ocean. And so the way these data sets were cleaned up were to track the movements of an individual ship, and then you could tell which location was not logical. And you could either try to correct for it, or you could, that is, try to move the ship back to where it really was, or you could omit that observation. So I think this is a way where the community could make a big difference, because we all discover these errors in the data sets, and we all keep that information to ourselves. We typically just correct the data and go on and write the papers. And so having a way to rescue data would be really important.
We going in order, or? Yeah, let's go in order. Bill.
Strong urge to go next.
Who? Bill. You're up.
Bill, sure.
Did you say you? Okay, I want to just throw out some rambling thoughts here that cover two areas. One is some of the challenges that I think are still confronting us, and then second, point to some solutions that I think are emerging. The first thing, though, looking from a 35,000-foot level, is that I think we have to recognize that technology changes on a very frequent basis, 1 to 3 years. I mean, we change virtually all of the major technology that we encounter on a daily basis. Most of us, many of us, not myself, but many of us change our cell phones. I know Dave changes his on an annual basis. Whenever the new iPhone's out, he's in line. The rest of us change our laptops or desktops on usually a 3-year refresh cycle. So technology changes very rapidly. The thing that changes very slowly is culture. And that, I think, is probably our biggest challenge that confronts us as we move ahead. I know I did a search, and I'm pretty sure I remember correctly that the first time the word metadata was used was sometime in the early 1980s. And yet it was sometime in the 2000s before I would argue that half of the audience of scientists would understand or recognize the word metadata. So that's 2+ decades in order for that term to even come into the daily lexicon. So I think that points to the fact that, as Carly mentioned, we're beginning to see more recognition that data are being treated as valuable products of the scientific enterprise, but it's coming slowly. Agencies like the National Science Foundation that now require data management plans, that's one step. It's a small step, though, and admittedly you can have a plan that is very weak in concept and implementation. So there's a lot that the funding agencies can do with respect to improving the state of affairs there. In addition, there's a lot that computer scientists and others can do ideally in conjunction with scientists in terms of creating the curates, i.e. new tools and so on that make things like metadata generation much easier. That, I think, is one of the other big challenges we face, is the lack of comprehensive metadata. And so many people are trying to create minimum standards for metadata now. In fact, there's a group that I'm a part of as well that associated with Research Data Alliance is looking at what are some of the minimal metadata standards. On one hand, that can be a good thing. On the other hand, I would argue that there's a real danger in that, because the more metadata you have, the more likely that that data set will be usable over the long term, and the more likely, if in fact it's structured metadata, that it can be interpreted by a machine. And ideally, to address some of the really grand challenge questions that face us, we need self-documenting data sets to the extent possible, and metadata that can be interpreted by machines, so that data integration challenge can be more easily overcome. The third one, and we're attempting to deal with this in Data 1, as Carly mentioned as well, deals with the fact that data right now are pretty siloed. They exist in individual laboratories, they exist on individual laptops, they exist in individual repositories, and it's really, really difficult right now if you want to do a meta-synthesis to identify where all the data are, to actually access those, download them, and so on. And for a major synthesis project, it goes much more than the 90% effort is required. It can be, 99.75% of the effort can simply be devoted towards gathering the data. And this is evidenced by a colleague of ours, Town Peterson, who does work on ecological niche modeling, and he has spent years of his life gathering data and actually going out to museums and so on, collecting the data, verifying it, and so on. An incredibly time-consuming job, when he would actually rather be running the niche models and interpreting the results and publishing the papers. And then another challenge I just want to point to, and then I'll get to some solutions here, is the cyber infrastructure researcher divide. And I think that is omnipresent in our business for most of us in the room. And that is, for example, NSF, and I'll pick on NSF just because hopefully they're not in the room, but that is they tend to support research that go out to either the cyber infrastructure communities or computer science communities and so on. And it's the computer scientists and the CI types that are essentially doing it all. And they have a preconception in terms of what the researchers need, but oftentimes that preconception is never verified. The researchers and the daily scientists, domain-specific scientists, are not brought into the conversation to ask, do you really need this? If I produce this product, will it meet your needs? Will it make your life easier? And that's another one of the grand challenges I think we face in the CI and technology world, is actually bringing the scientists into the equation. So I just want to touch upon a few solutions. I'll go over a couple of these very quickly because Carly mentioned them actually in her talk. But one is the changing the culture. I think the joint data access policy that Carly mentioned was that was put forth by Dryad Repository, which is part of Data 1, was a huge step in the right direction. And that is that now there are 60-some journals that require data to be submitted at the time of the publication, and those go through the peer review process as well. So when journals and professional societies step up to the plate, that's when we can start changing the culture of the scientific community. Secondly, I think requiring data management plans was a step in the right direction. I think, though, that that's probably going to go too slowly, and NSF really needs to step up to the plate, as do other funders and so on, and actually require more than just plans, but actually implementation as well. And I know it wasn't until the Long-Term Ecological Research Program had a mandate from NSF, and there were panelists on review teams and so on that looked at the LTER data products to determine whether or not they were well documented and of high quality. it wasn't until then that people had the threat of their funding being yanked that they really stepped up to the plate and improved the quality of their data and created the documentation and so on. Third, in terms of interoperability issues and so on that I think are really challenging, there are now a number of different standards groups or alliances that are being formed to try and address some of these issues. Many of these will be familiar to a lot of you. And again, all of these are now dealing with data, even though they may not have started out that way, surprisingly enough. There's a new one called the Research Data Alliance that's initially initiated by groups from Australia, the European Union, and the U.S. There's a group actually meeting here in Chicago today, DELSA, which stands for Data Enabled Life Sciences Alliance, is meeting as we speak and dealing with data issues in the life sciences. The Internet Engineering Task Force, IETF, another one. Internet 2 is now switched into dealing with data issues along the same lines as these other alliances and consortia. World Wide Web Consortium, W3C, CODATA, the Committee on Data for Science and Technology, and then GBIF, Global Biodiversity Information Facility. And this is just a small number. And all of these groups now are trying to deal with some of the interoperability issues. But again, a challenge they face is bringing the researchers into the fold. So I would ask the question of all of them, where are the scientists? Where are the researchers? And that's when I think they're going to really make real traction, is when they bring those people into the equation. Another challenge that they face, and hopefully they will also overcome this, is the tendency to focus on short-term outcomes. And the Research Data Alliance met last week, and one of their goals was to have working groups focus on actionable items that could be completed in 12 to 18 months. And there's some benefit to that because you can show a product or outcome in a short period of time, but nevertheless that really narrows your thinking in terms of the kinds of questions or challenges that you can address. So there needs to be some hybrid models out here where we do get some short-term solutions, but we also keep the end game in sight and we can address some of these problems that are going to take probably 5 or 10 years to resolve. And then finally, I think another step in the right direction is not only Data One, but other platforms like that. LifeWatch is another one from the European Union and so on that is focused on resolving a lot of these interoperability challenges and making data from a variety of repositories and so on much more accessible. And those are all steps, I think, in the right direction.
Great. So, I'd like to just, I love them right after Bill, because I think there's a lot to build off of what he said. I guess I'd like to just I have two main points, one around the sustainability of data resources, and another around kind of reframing the problem a little bit. But before I do that, I just want to mention that we are a funder who tries to do good about around data. We have a data sharing policy. We've had it since 2005. But more than just a policy, we also fund both per grant and across grants, data repositories, data sharing. We have a pretty aggressive embargo limit for most of our data. And really, I think this goes to the heart of what most funders care about, which is that the work that they fund makes a difference in the world, and the data that is generated by the research that we fund, we feel needs to be out in the world. So that's part of the scientific process, is to have that out there. And so I guess that goes a little bit to reframing, which is that one of the, I think, reasons why we're seeing really the way that the problem has been framed as a carrot and stick is because we're missing the researcher that's in the middle of that carrot and stick. And so Bill started talking about getting the researchers involved. I think the way I'd like to propose reframing the problem is that rather than thinking about why scientists aren't adhering to data curation practices or why things aren't happening, think about how the tools give back to the tools for data curation, the tools for data preservation give value back to the researcher. So if you think about it in terms of value proposition back to the researcher, you actually have a chance at building something that will be used. So for instance, data citation, in order to give academic credit back to the researcher, is a great idea. The problem is that that isn't seen as valid academic credit right now. So you kind of have a problem underneath the problem. So you can cite your data, you can add DOIs to your data, but if tenure committees, granting agencies, and others don't consider that contribution valuable the same way it does, say, a Nature paper or a science paper, then there's no real value to the researcher in that solution. So we're starting to build more and more solutions that don't necessarily provide value to the researcher, even though we see kind of an endpoint in mind, and it's valuable effort to kind of have it in place. You certainly want to get out of this chicken and egg problem. You do need to kind of lift under the carpet a little bit and look at, how you, it's beyond incentivize, kind of motivate the change in behavior that you're looking for. So what I think the other thing that this connects to is that data is only part of the research products that that scientists produce. So the research object is getting more and more complex, and scientists produce code, data, workflows, all sorts of various things that need to be recognized, I think, and we're in a model where we really only recognize papers. And so until we kind of expand, we as in the community of scientists expand the value that all of these different products give back to that produce impact in science, then we're going to be kind of stuck here for a long, long time. And so the other point, just real quickly, is the sustainability of these data resources. So we've funded some data repositories in a big way, and no matter how much money you give to a data repository or a data system or cyber infrastructure, eventually that money runs out. And what I'm seeing is no kind of long-term plan for how these data live on. So even if we correct all the quality issues that Jeff has and others have, and all of the kind of buy-in questions about how you get people to actually get it in there, then what? And I think libraries have a great role to play here, because that really is the kind of natural mission for a library. But there is a gap, and it's not necessarily shrinking, between the technical capabilities of scientific research and what libraries are able to provide. And so, yeah, I think that's a big issue. I don't have any great solutions. I'm just kind of drumming up some new problems, but maybe someone else has some ideas.
Okay, probably not surprising, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the technical infrastructure side of data repositories. And I'm going to focus in particular on a couple of issues that I think have a very simple technical solution and have a very high gain in efficiency and cost effectiveness for interoperability between different data repositories. So we all know there's lots of different data repositories out there. There's probably thousands of them. And unfortunately, there's almost as many ways of interacting with those repositories in a programmatic sense. So, the programmatic level, how you add content to a repository, how you list the contents in a repository and so forth. There's almost as many different ways of doing that as there are repositories. And that leads to all sorts of challenges when you're building tools to interact with data repositories. So, for example, if you're running R or MATLAB to do some analysis, and you're retrieving data from, say, a merit repository, for example, and you want to retrieve content from, let's say, a DuraSpace repository, then they're very different protocols. So you have to write little adapters to retrieve stuff from one repository and the other and so forth. And this adds a tremendous expense to any tool developer that is building, or even researchers that are trying to access content from these different repositories. So it seems that at the lowest level of interactions with data repositories, there is a very common pattern that we can take advantage of. And if the community of, I don't know what you call it, data scientists perhaps, came to some agreement as to what the minimum requirements, common minimum requirements for data repositories would be, then we could build a suite of tools that, at a base level could interoperate with every data repository out there. And that would dramatically reduce the cost of implementation for tool developers and so forth, and make it a lot easier for researchers to access content, to add content, and so forth. This is an issue that we've faced head-on in the Data One project, because we are working with a number of heterogeneous repositories. Pretty much every repository we're working with so far has a different protocol in front of it. And the simple solution is, well, there's a couple of different solutions to this. One is to ask the repositories to do some implementation work to come to some common standard. Another approach is to add a shim somewhere in between the client and the repository that talks the same language. So there's lots of different technical approaches to doing this, but I think the simplest one is to come up with a common low-level standard that enabled things like, I had a common way of doing things like creating content, updating content, deleting content when necessary, retrieving content, obviously, so retrieving data or metadata and so forth, listing the information, so that is, in the simplest sense, just generating a list of all the content that's available in a repository. It could be more sophisticated, like specifying spatial search or temporal search and so forth. And then finally, perhaps even a common way of defining access control rules. And that one's kind of a bit contentious, because there's many different systems, and it's a big challenge, not just for the data repository community. But if we came across or developed a common standard for that, then it'd make life a lot simpler for a lot of folks that are working with data, and then we can move on to the higher level interactions for supporting things like value-added services that sit on top of these low-level systems. And that approach has worked really well for a lot of different systems, like your web browser, for example. All the different web browsers, they rely on a very common protocol for accessing information from all the web servers. It'd be great if we had the same sort of thing for tools that interacted with data repositories. It's not that much different, and I think it's a very simple step to take. It's just a matter of getting the community behind developing this common standard.
Thank you. I like that. If you didn't hear that, the librarian gets the last word. So as Carly mentioned, I'm the Data Services Coordinator at the University of Washington Libraries. Just to give you a little information about what I do, that job description that Liz Lyon had up earlier, if you were here in an earlier session, as the institutional data scientist, that's apparently what I am. A term that we use in my position description is actually data concierge, which I also like. Sounds so she. The issue that I worry about is how to provide data management support services to the researchers. And I'm going to address 3 challenges that we kind of have come up with. In my role as Data Services Coordinator, I was given this position 2 years ago, and it was a temporary position. I was tasked to develop and implement a data services program in the libraries. I chair a team of 8 librarians from throughout our library system who all have full-time responsibilities in other areas of the library. And so their participation is really, as time allows, out of the goodness of their hearts and their interest in data. So the 3 challenges that I'm going to discuss today is, the first one is that the libraries is not the first place that researchers think of when it comes to data management issues. And I'm even going to posit that we're not the second place that they think of either, unfortunately. This is sad to me because I think of it just as a natural progression of the information management skills that we've been honing over the centuries. As the atmospheric sciences librarian, I have volumes on my shelves full of weather data. I know how to deal with those. There have been standards that we've developed over the years that tell me how to deal with those. The standards for digital data are still being debated. And this leads to my second challenge, which is we librarians have a lot to learn in this area. I was not taught data management and data curation in library school. Those classes didn't exist like they do now at Syracuse and University of Illinois. So I've kind of been learning from those around me. And my position as data services coordinator is discipline agnostic. So not only do I have a lot to learn in terms of data management, but the stuff that I have to learn varies widely. The questions that I have are different depending on which subject area we're talking about, whether I'm talking to social scientists, or humanities faculty. And their language and needs all vary also, depending on who I'm talking to. So some of the questions I have are, what are the actual needs of researchers? And how are they really different across disciplines? Or are they similar, but they're just different in how they're described and identified? One question that I was asked to answer just recently by my dean was, what are the data repository needs for the researchers on our campus? And I've come up with a bunch of different answers, but I'm not sure what the answers are, the audience for who these answers apply. So are people just interested in discovery and finding data sets that are already out there? Is that what I need to look for? Just some kind of catalog resource? Are they interested in long-term storage, just a place to put their data to fulfill data management plan requirements? Are they looking for a sandbox where they can upload their data and then share it with other collaborators until it's in its publishable form and then, again, put into long-term storage? Are they looking for the ability to query across all the data sets at one time? And then once we figure out answers to those questions and whether we're going to host our own institutional repository, we have an institutional repository currently for a traditional one for documents. So do I just have us make it available for our researchers to deposit their data in there, or do we need a completely separate repository that is really focused on data? Once we figure out that, how do I determine which data sets I select to go in there and which ones to deselect and how to dispose of them? How do I identify what data sets are going to be of value to people? And then there's the whole ethical and legal questions surrounding licensing and copyright issues, which I'm not even going to get into now. You're welcome. And then finally, and I believe that Bill's addressed this earlier talking about Data One, is how do I insert my services into the workflow? Because if I don't, I know they're not going to get used. I have been extremely lucky in that I have really strong administrative support in the libraries, and they've been providing a lot of funding so that members of my team and myself can go around to lots of different continuing education opportunities and learn from the librarians that have been doing this a lot longer than I have, such as those at Purdue and Cornell and CDL, UVA. And what has been most valuable, besides networking and meeting these folks, has been that they also have the same questions, and yet they've been able to move their data services program forward. So that has helped me feel courageous in being able to move the data services program forward that we have at the UW. And the third challenge that I've identified is that researchers will not come to me until they're at a point of need, which unfortunately is usually at 4 o'clock on a Friday. Thankfully, and I'm sure my fellow the researchers on my campus probably don't agree with me on this, but I am thankful that NSF came out with its DMP requirement when it did, because it created a point of need right when I was trying to get our data services program up and running. So when that came out, days before it went into effect, we put together a website with tools and resources and information about data management plan requirements. We used the Office of Research to market that to researchers across campus, and then I followed up by doing a lot of coffee talks with different research groups on campus who are doing data, so that I could market the services that we were planning to offer to them. I was also able to, through those relationships that I built through those coffee talks, they were able to market our services back to their faculty, so I didn't have to do it all. They also provided a conduit so that we could get feedback on what the most pressing data management needs were for the faculty related to those groups. We were able to identify gaps in services so that we weren't duplicating services that those groups were already offering. And it also raised our profile so that addressed that first challenge I mentioned, where now they were starting to think about the libraries when it came to data management needs. Some of the services that we're offering now, just this summer, we aligned ourselves with the existing library research support services called ResearchWorks. So we're now the ResearchWorks Data Services Program. And it helped, again, just raise our profile so that we were identified with services that were already being offered. We offer data management plan consultation services. Just earlier this year, we signed up with EasyID through the California Digital Library so we can offer data citation services. We are working with our Office of Sponsored Programs to create customizable text to add to the data management planning tool so that when our researchers use that tool, they will see what resources are specifically available to them through the University of Washington. And as of a few weeks ago, my position was permanent, so we are now expanding the data services program, and just yesterday I got confirmation that I'm going to be able to hire a half-time person who will report to me and will be in charge of creating a data services curriculum and communication plan so that we can make people aware of what it is we're doing and what we can do. And now that my position is permanent, we have started discussions with our data services team to create a strategic plan to move forward. And as part of that, we are running a survey this fall of our researchers to get more explicit information on what their data management needs are.
Did any of you guys have something to add or augment after everybody spoke?
Oh, probably lots. So,
did anybody out in the audience have a question for the panel?
Hi, yes, I'm Kenji Takeda from Microsoft, but I used to be an academic till 18 months ago and was involved in this in the UK. So Chris nailed it basically in terms of if you're going for promotion, it's citations, right, and impact factor for your journal publications, right? That's what you care about. And so, academics are under extreme pressure to deliver, and therefore they need incentives. They're busy, okay? And actually, as a researcher, you might not care what somebody wants to do with your data in 5 or 10 years' time. What you care about is your next Nature paper, okay? So the added value is to the researcher for short-term, instant gratification, I think is a key. I mean, the whole issue of incentives and sticks and carrots, and in the UK, there are sticks and fewer carrots, I would say. So,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I won't. A lot of researchers do have a more generous attitude toward this. So, for example, the data that we collect at our instrument station is available to you as soon as it's available to me. It's on a web service. So the issue, the data management plans from NSF, for me, I don't have any problems during the life of the project. The issue is what happens, eventually I'll retire, and sometime after that I'll die, and and I don't see any sort of a plan, at least that we have, to transition those data to a permanent archive. But this issue of that researchers don't want to do this, I'd like to really see whether that's true, because I'm a little more optimistic that by and large people do want to see their data used. And the fact that we now have a way of assigning DOIs or ArcIDs or something like that to data means that they can be cited. And but part of the problem, I think, we know from the behavioral sciences that in general people don't don't change behavior so that good things will happen to them. They generally change behavior to avoid bad things happening to them. But I would think in the empirical sciences that this might give people a leg up in their, because generally the empiricists have much lower publication rates than the theoreticians. And this may be a partial solution to that problem. So I don't think the incentives are that difficult. It's the mechanisms that are hard.
I know I'm not on the panel technically, but I just want to... Okay, great. In that case, let me just say very briefly, because I know there's another question over there, not to be contrary to what you just said, but I'm out all the time preaching the benefits of data sharing and data management to scientists. And how many of my personal data sets have I actually archived in a long-term repository? 2. Out of many. And 1 I only did out of guilt and shame because it was a genetics data set, and I didn't put it in GenBank, and I published, and I got a lot of flack from people who contacted me and said, why aren't your sequences in GenBank? And so that pushed me into doing it. And then I recently archived a data set in DataUp just to say I did it. So those are the 2 out of all the ones. And it's not because I don't believe it's important, and it's obviously, and it's not because I don't know how to do it. It's just the time and the energy that it takes to clean it up and get it ready to go and make sure it's well documented. So yeah, the cost is a big challenge. I think that most researchers will say, yeah, let's do that, let's share data. But when the rubber hits the road, it becomes more challenging. But did you have a question?
So I actually had I've got a million questions, but I'll be restrained. I just wanted to make a comment. So Andrew Treloar, Australian National Data Service, with the data site, DOI Registrar for Australia, among many other things. And it was, I guess, a comment on Kenji's comment or question. And some researchers are more enlightened. Many researchers are time poor and are very, very focused on just doing what they need to do. And so we used to talk to researchers about data sharing as an altruistic thing. Do it for the greater good. Think of the child in front of the laptop on your slides who wants to be able to access data so he can share it with his kids his fellow students at playtime tomorrow. And that works for some people, but it doesn't work for others. And so something that's worked better for us, which I share with you for free, is talk to researchers not about sharing data with someone they've never met. Talk to researchers about sharing data with their future selves. Do this and you'll be able to access your data in 5 years. And every researcher that I've met, including me, I have a mag tape in my office that I didn't migrate off the machine before the university I worked for at the time trashed the last machine that would read it. Every researcher has got a data loss horror story. And if you say to them, do this, and not only will you be able to get access to it in 5 years' time, but other people will be able to as well, that's a more compelling argument.
I just want to say yes. Absolutely. I also just had a note from one of Carly's slides about who cares, and it's definitely funders and institutes, but ultimately you care a lot. And I've also talked to researchers, and they don't like that there's data stuck in their desk drawer or on a hard drive on a shelf. They don't like it, and trying to reproduce their own work, or trying to just leverage what they've done. I think that is compelling, and that's what I guess I was trying to say, not eloquently, about providing the value to the researcher. That's compelling to someone, whereas we've been focusing, and it's the same technology, so we're building the right technology. It's just how we frame the value of that. It's not to the other researcher; it's to yourself first.
So my name is Kees Laat, University of Amsterdam. There are different ways and uses of data. So one can try to store, preserve and so on data so that one can redo the same experiment so that experiments become verifiable, or that you can use the results somewhere else. So I think you gave an example where data from ships and so on the way how you analyze it makes it what the results you get and what results you publish. So the question which comes up is, you do not probably only publish the end data, but also a previous step in the analysis, or even a more previous step in the analysis, or 10 petabytes of CERN data per year. So where is the boundary of the data you want to publish? For example, in this gentleman's example, a Mac tape is quite raw data, unless it is your final data, of course. So where is the boundary of what data you want to preserve and publish?
So I would argue that it should be much more than the data that's being considered. It should be what's necessary to reproduce a set of analyses or results that end up in a paper. And that's often lots of different types of data sources. It's very comprehensive metadata. It's quite often the algorithms, the software tools and so on that go into that. All that ideally needs to be preserved in some way, shape, or form so that, again, the results can be reproduced. One of the, and I don't disagree with Jeff's comments earlier about data quality, but I just finished a project where I went back and with a student looked at all of the data papers that I published as editor of Ecological Society of America's data papers. And we've gone back through and looked at every single review and categorized all of the errors that reviewers found. And without exception, the highest number of errors, and every paper had a large number of errors associated with it, but the highest percentage of them all were inadequate metadata. So people simply were making shameless assumptions about what others might need in order to reproduce the data, and they were leaving out really key information, and sometimes very important things like where the data were collected, instrumentation that was used, so on and so forth. So that's a really big area where we need, I would argue, new tools, new approaches for getting that metadata out. Again, having sensors that are more automated and provide metadata on the fly, so to speak, that can be easily ingested, and then even software that help step scientists through the process of developing that comprehensive metadata, much like the DMP tool. If any of you have ever looked through that, it sort of steps you through the process in terms of, here are the questions you need to answer in order to have a good data management plan. Well, we need similar tools like that make the metadata generation process much easier.
Yeah, so I have a question. I'm Beth Plaley, Indiana University, and this is kind of a question to Stephanie, but it's based on something that Bill had said. So, Bill, you had mentioned that we need to get the domain researchers involved in things like Research Data Alliance, Internet 2, DELSA, and I think that's a good point. And I think about the libraries because I work a lot with our library, and they sort of solve the kind of the representation issue. You'll have a chemistry librarian, you'll have a physics librarian. And so one of the problems, if we try to get domain representation, we get one person who represents their science, and so trying to get that representation is difficult when you're engaging the domain scientists directly. So the libraries have solved this, So if you've got someone who's an e-science or data librarian or whatever lovely name you had for yourself, Stephanie, you've got them. I mean, they potentially, not now, but in a few years from now, 5 years from now, could represent the domains with their data needs in ways that we don't have as well today in a general way. I don't know, Stephanie, if you see that in a growth path for the data librarians or not.
That's a difficult question for me to answer because I'm remembering a slide that Dr. Jen had earlier, in that when you look at the expectations for data scientists, we're looking for Superman. I'm not Superman, and I've grappled with this question of should the libraries, what's our scope? Where do we get involved? Like, I was surprised when I saw Liz put that description up because I never thought of myself as a data scientist. I'm a librarian. So what is the scope? What is my role as librarian, and how far do I go? Is there maybe another intermediary that needs to be on the departmental side. I don't have a degree in every single subject that I represent. I don't have a degree in atmospheric sciences, and I'm the atmospheric sciences librarian. So, where does the scope of what we do begin and end? And that's going to vary, institution to institution. Am I answering your question at all, or am I going off on a tangent?
No, it wasn't a question.
Okay.
Your observation on it.
So that's kind of where, and I don't have a good answer to that because I go back and forth on that question a lot. I'd be interested to hear what some other librarians in the audience might think on that question, though.
So
what we do at University of Mexico is our last 8 or 10 hires have all been data librarians, and they are people that typically have not gone through traditional, information library science schools and so on, but they have a lot of practical experience in specific domains, and then some background in informatics as well, and librarianship. But the thing that makes it work for them is you go into the library, you never see them. They're out in the departments. They're working in individual laboratories and so on. They're meeting the students, and they're learning how they do their work, and then they're able to make observations in terms of, here's a tool that you may not be aware of that makes your life easier. And that one-on-one interaction has just been absolutely invaluable. And the data librarians, they benefit. It's a win-win because they can dispense good advice, but at the same time they're learning. They go into work and they know that at the end of that day they will have learned 2 or 3 new things that they didn't know before. So it's really pretty exciting business. And I think it's just this whole title of data scientist has just got immense opportunities associated with it. And if I were going to encourage anyone going through school now, to consider that as a career because it's really, really exciting. It's not, some comments were made earlier this morning about data being boring, but I would argue that, this is really the cutting edge. This is where you see the really neat stuff in science happening. So I think it's pretty exciting, and we just need to convey that.
So Beth, I agree with you. Well, it's what we've always done. I mean, we've always had to reconcile and understand relationships among smaller domains and how they work together. But I was hoping everybody's ready for a different question. Yeah. Do we still have time? Okay, actually, Carly, I wanted to pick up on something that you said in your introductory remarks and see if I could get the panel to bite on it. So you mentioned the first-class object, which Andrew is famous for saying, but other people are famous for saying it and picking up on it. And in particular, so you also then mentioned data publication as a way of thinking about data as first-class objects. But right now we're in a moment in time when other people famous for saying data should be first-class objects are saying, but data publication is the wrong model. So there's a new paper, well, it's been out for a long time in various forms, but in data science by Mark Parsons and Peter Fox, bringing a lot of criticism to the data publication model as not only the wrong fit for data, but probably dangerous in terms of really long-term accessibility, discoverability, the expectations around, just lots and lots of reasons. So I'm just wondering if the panel would be willing to say what they think about the model of data publication and possible other models.
Chad? Yeah, I guess I would, I think data publication is good. I have, even though I'm old, I have a Facebook page, all right? And, on your Facebook page, you can put your favorite quotes. And one of mine is that good data can outlast bad theory. And it's, in the field of geomorphology, that people are still using data that G.K. Gilbert made, measurements that he made back in the late 19th century. So the collection of data and the curation of those data and the quality checking it's a tough problem. It's a it's a hard thing to do, and those of us who do it spend a lot of time on it. And it's, you know, it's really a shame if I'm the only one who uses the data that I collect and manage and curate and quality check. So in terms of the benefit to science, it's whether we call it publication or not is a different term. But you know, I'm happy to make those. I'd love to make my data more easily available to people. Now, I'm pretty generous with it, but a lot of what I do is I share data because somebody sends me an email, and I dump stuff on an FTP site and, you know, and give them the address and they go get it. But I mean, I'd love to send you all my data. But, you know, so I'm more optimistic about things than a lot of people here.
Yeah, I want to support data publication as well for a couple reasons. One being that peer review process that goes into reviewing a paper, and the same thing that goes in reviewing a data publication, is really invaluable. And I would say, as a broad sweeping generalization, that as editor of data papers for ESA, that those data sets that have gotten the greatest use, they've been used for multiple publications that have been peer reviewed, and the data themselves have been, you know, used by numerous graduate students and doctoral students and so on and so forth. You know, those typically are the highest quality. They still have errors in them, though, that the peer reviewers pick up. But that final step of going through the peer review process, maybe you don't have to do it for necessarily a, quote, data publication, but that peer review process is really invaluable in terms of creating a data product that can live for the long term.
I want to make one quick comment about that. Have any of you read the Mark Parsons paper about this? It's a really good read, and you should check it out if you have a chance. But the big debate is whether or not the publication kind of metaphor is appropriate. And on that note, I agree it's not appropriate. But for lack of a better phrase, it's being used because it represents kind of a system that we're all very familiar with. My pipe dream is that data publication will take some form of the type of thing that you see in, say, Stack Overflow or some of these kind of code websites where you put your data out there, you allow the community to vet it and use it and see how it works and comment on it and rate it, and then you build the community around the data sets. And if they're not good and they're not being used, they'll kind of fall to the bottom. And if they're good and they're high quality, then they'll float to the top. And so that's my kind of dream for what this data publication could look like, because I think that peer review for data publication in the traditional journal sense would be extremely challenging to figure out how to do that well. But that's my 2 cents. So there's probably a question out there somewhere that Chris is going to get the microphone to somebody.
Yeah, I know. I actually thought maybe I'd even ask one myself. That's kind of the nice thing about being the chair. You can, but I'll share.
Hi, Dave Martinson from the American Chemical Society. I'd like to follow up a first-class object question a little bit. And one of the things that has been a theme through several of the sessions has been citing data. And from the chemists that I talk to, and I raise this question sometimes, I think there are data and there are data. And so, and you do a study, you may send the compound you've synthesized out to a service lab, and they'll do crystallography or mass spec or IR, and that's all pretty much routine, and there's no intellectual effort involved. And so, yeah, I could post that in a repository as part of my data management plan. I probably should. But is the value of that, if that's cited, is that the same as some very sophisticated experiment that I've done and modification of some instrument to get some really high-quality, one-off type of data out of it? And then also, I think there may be the perspective that the real intellectual effort is in understanding the data and coming up with some explanation of why there are anomalies in this set of structures versus this one. And that's where I really should be getting credit, and that's really the traditional article. Yeah. So could you comment a little bit on what you mean by data citation and what the the value is and how you distinguish between those cases?
Y'all gonna leave this to me?
There's one real benefit of data citation that I think we haven't mentioned, and that is, it's too bad Phil Bourne was not able to attend this meeting, because there's a lot of interesting stuff that he's done with the protein data bank, and in particular, there's actually been at least one discovery based on tracking citations for data, because they realized that people from two different medical communities were citing the same protein in the database, and it was some of them were from the infectious diseases, and the others were from cardiology, and that there's something in this particular protein that applies to both of those. And so that community has done a pretty good job, and I think contributed important intellectual procedures to us. And, you know, I tend to read a lot of the papers that cite my papers, partly because I get automatically notified by various publishers that some paper has been cited, and often if it looks interesting, I'll go read it. In a sense, though, I might be just as interested in people in work that was using the same data sets that I'm using, that I might really have something in common and could learn something from reading those papers. And currently I have no way of locating them. So there's this credit to the researcher that we talk about for publishing data, but there's also a huge benefit to everybody if we can track how people are using certain data sets. And
so that's a benefit based on an analysis of the protein data bank and articles kind of surrounding that, but it's not related to the specific data collection of that particular protein structure. So the credit comes from
the paper instead of
the entire environment, rather than just the fact that those structures were measured.
So, do you want to comment on it? So I think what I would say is that I'm not interested in, kind of, to use my little stick figure metaphor there, I don't want to kick the publications back to economy. I just want to allow the data citation piece to be up there as well. I mean, if we look at them as kind of complementary instead of, it's definitely not going to replace traditional publication, because you're exactly right. The analysis and understanding of a data set and the interesting nuance that comes with that is not something that you can replace with a data publication or a data set that just has kind of an abstract and the methods, But I do think that it's hard for us to imagine all the ways that the data could be used. And if we make the data kind of independent of the journal, it allows other fields to find value in that data set that maybe they wouldn't have picked up on it before because it was in the wrong journal, or because they didn't know the keyword that they should have used to look in that particular journal for an article that might have something to do with their work. So I think there's a place for both. And as researchers, we have to decide how we want to value those pieces. But the important thing is that we do, in fact, value data a little bit more than we are right now. Comment down there? Question?
Yes, actually I'm answering your question. You had asked about whether there was data review taking place, peer review of data. And actually, yeah, it is taking place. But I guess the answer is the answer that this gentleman gave, that he said there's data and there's data. And that at domain archives, they're peer reviewing data that are appropriate for a particular domain, so the scientific community from that domain is using their criteria in terms of how that data might benefit that particular domain to evaluate the data. And it's an extensive process, and it's getting more and more extensive all the time because there's more and more attention now being put on data. and the archiving and dissemination of data.
There's a question back there.
Oh, okay. Actually,
we have 5 more minutes, so
okay,
just
super.
so everybody knows.
Kenji, do you mind if I ask one? Okay, it's my turn. I've got the mic. So I wrote this question down actually before Stephanie had discussed ways in which to get people interested in it. One of in using the tools and services that are available in the library. So I was very glad when she talked about how she advertised and the support that the iSchool at the University of Washington is providing to their own research community. One of the challenges, it seems to me, because we are cutting across so many different domains, is how do we get the word out when tools become available across a broader set of things? I know you and I have worked very closely on the environmental science space, but some of these tools could be accessible, as you had said in your talk earlier, that they'd be accessible to other domains as well. Or perhaps that was at the Demo Fest, I'm not sure. But you get my drift, right? How do we actually get the word out and get people using these tools and technologies? Because there are tools that are out there people aren't aware of.
No, you first. That was for you. So I've already talked about my methods, and I really have found it to be extremely effective to take advantage of the Office of Research because they talk to the researchers and they work with the researchers. Getting back to the question earlier that I didn't get into is that I do try to utilize the subject librarians as well because they are the direct conduit to so many different departments. And so this new position that we're hiring, part of the job that they have is to communicate what it is we're doing and what tools we've identified and get them out to their users so that they're also aware. And I've really found it extremely useful, as I mentioned before, in talking to the research groups. It's too hard to try and get to individual faculty, but boy, when I talk to the research group, I have contacts in those research groups throughout our campus, getting key people there to know about it, and they talk to the researchers, they work with the researchers. They're the ones, it's kind of our way of inserting into their usual communication mode.
So, did Chris want to say something?
Yeah, please, Chris, please.
Just real briefly, I mean, I think a lot about data science in terms of the discipline, within the disciplines and not so much in the library systems. And one of the benefits, I think, of developing this notion of data science as either practice or as a way of practicing science is that data scientists, at least in industry, know about tools from a variety of different sectors, and that sharing of knowledge about what tools are between practitioners is probably the most effective way. Having an outsider tell you about something is much different than having your buddy tell you. So I think as we develop a notion of data science within the disciplines, that the cross-fertilization of tools, whether it be about data curation or about a new algorithm or a new whatever, is going to spread much faster. And we're seeing that in industry, so there's no reason why it can't happen in academia.
Yeah, so Liz mentioned the UK requirement. So by the 1st of May 2015, every UK university doing engineering and physical sciences research must have a metadata catalogue that points to all of the data from that funding agency projects. So in the UK, the institutions are basically taking control of this and saying, right, chief information officer, the chief financial officers, right, how much it's going to cost me. The vice chancellors are saying, okay, so we need to do this, or we're not going to get any money from the research council. So, with that, in that context, I just want to toss a question in terms of institutional data management versus discipline repositories, metadata catalogues, and just wanted to ask the panel what your view was in terms of that sort of interaction. Because certainly in the UK, I think there's a shift towards institutions now really pushing it, because there's a hard deadline for this.
Well, since the mic is here, I'll answer. I think one thing I've seen is a number of institutions have recognized that there are very specialized repositories out there, and even though they may have an institutional repository themselves, that they can, I mean, it makes more sense if someone is generating protein, structures and so on, to submit those to Protein Data Bank. If they do genetic sequences, that should go in GenBank. And There are other hydrological data services and so on that are much better poised. So I think, forward-thinking institutions are much more open and just say, we want your data, protected in an appropriate repository, wherever that may be. And if by default there's no other choice, then, our particular university or, research institution archive is available for your use. And I think that's probably the best way to go. Some of the repositories have really neat special tools as well that help facilitate analysis and discovery, and they've got whole communities that are built around them that are really useful to take advantage of.
Okay, with that, we're going to have to stop because I have to go. However, I'm sure our panel can continue to answer questions over coffee and then the reception that starts at 5:15 outside. Yeah. Yes, the reception. No, okay, yes, reception, of course. So if you guys don't mind, let's thank the panelists for their talking.